All right, here we go, 14.2 and 14.3. So like I talked about the end of 14.1 yesterday, we're going to kind of double up a little bit because I talked about this real briefly in the 14.1 video. So we have all the synthetic compounds in us. It's impossible to avoid. And we talked about that with like that 10 Americans video as well. It's the same basic idea. They're just simply everywhere around us, and it's almost impossible for us to avoid unless we're basically living off the grid and growing our own food and everything. It's really hard to avoid that stuff. So moving to 363, I talk about here basically pesticides. Pesticides and the pesticide that's luckily been banned is a thing called DDT. They are very, very, very harmful to humans. So developing nations, unfortunately, they still use that DDT to control the mosquito populations. And that's what we were talking about earlier with that cost benefit analysis. So mosquitoes, they pass malaria. And so the cost of not having the mosquito population under control is that your population is going to be really suffering from mosquitoes. So the benefit, or excuse me, they're going to be suffering from malaria. So the benefit is there's very little or not as much malaria. The cost of it is that it's unfortunately like in their food and stuff like that, so it's building up in their bodies. Now, not all natural chemicals are good. Think about plant poisons. Those are natural. They're not good for anybody. And so when companies try and do greenwashing by like throwing on the natural word to stuff, it shouldn't mean anything to you. Like, oh, this is natural. Well, natural doesn't mean quality. It doesn't mean like it's healthy for you, anything like that. So 364. So there's a ton of vocab on this page. Obviously, all the things that are bolded, like you can see, like pathway inhibitor right there. That's the end of endocrine disruptors right there, is what you talk about it. So there's a lot of vocab, so be familiar with that vocab. Now, AP doesn't do like vocab tests, and I'm not going to do the same either, but you need to be able to utilize those words in answers. Or if they talk about those or they have those words in the question, you need to be understanding what they're talking about so that way you can answer the question. So they're endocrine disruptors. So basically, this is what controls your hormones, your whole endocrine system. Testosterone and estrogen and all those different hormones you got going on in your body. Basically, this is your body's way of kind of talking to itself. But disrupting that system can either hasten or diminish that hormone signaling. So, for example, it's gonna, it puts women into menopause earlier because of all the chemicals they're getting screwed up because it's gonna hasten the hormone signaling to start menopause. That's an easy one to talk about. So moving to 365, we'll off the screen there. Oh, I should talk about these real quick. I'm gonna zoom out to show these pictures. This is what I'm talking about with basically kind of like those disrupting stuff. So normal hormone binding, you can see you got your receptors right there. You got your hormones on the outside. So basically the hormones bond to the receptor. It goes inside the cell. It tells the cell what to do. But if you have a hormone mimic, which is one of those, the different toxins we're talking about, that can bond to those receptors. It says response identical to that caused by a human. So it's basically mimicking, hey, you should start this earlier. Like one of the things that I've seen studies about is basically teenagers are hitting puberty earlier and earlier. So instead of hitting puberty at 13, 14, 15, girls especially are hitting puberty at like 8, 9, and 10 years old because of exactly what we're talking about here. These hormone mimics are causing the cells to start the process earlier. One of the things I talked about today during our discussion was basically that organisms sequester toxins, or they basically kind of put them away, kind of lock them up. Think of it that way, like putting them in a lockbox to kind of go away. They sequester toxins they can't get rid of into fatty tissues and cell membranes. That's basically their way to kind of get rid of some of those toxins. Now, in 366, this is talking about acute exposure versus chronic exposure. So you can see high exposure in a short time period. So like think of like a nuclear meltdown. If you're one of the scientists who are working in that, all of a sudden you have an acute exposure. You're exposed to a bunch of it really quickly. Or chronic exposure, low exposure over a long period of time. So you can see some of the examples I wrote here. So like smoking, and it's not even necessarily if you're smoking. My grandpa smoked a pipe. So if I went and saw him, every weekend my whole life, that's going to be a chronic exposure that I was experiencing. Now we're going to move into the toxic substances. That's basically what 14.2 is about. So moving to 367, if I can get it on the screen here. So toxins can travel the world and affect organisms far from the toxin source. So air currents and water currents move them all over the world. I'm going to shimmy back to the previous page. This is diagramming exactly what I just said. So I'll kind of get number 3 in view there. So you can see at low latitudes, evaporation of pollutants exceeds deposition. So that's why that is bolder than that one. Then atmospheric currents and oceanic currents move that stuff around. Then evaporation is lower here, but the deposition is higher. So it deposits it, up there. We can see there's North Pole, so like northern Canada, Greenland, stuff like that. So that's what it's talking about with toxins can spread around the world. Now, figure 1413, which is right above what we're talking about right now, I think is a really good image to kind of study and understand. So, industry and manufacturing is spitting out a whole bunch of things. So, some consumer products, that's what you build your home out of. Some workplace products, think of computers and staplers and all that stuff. We got medicines and materials, go to hospitals. The pesticides and fertilizers go out to the crops. And they got a whole bunch of waste products, either going straight to the soil, surface and groundwater, or putting it in the air. So a whole bunch of things come from industry and manufacturing, good and bad. So you can see from the home, consumer products go to the humans. The workplace exposure goes to the humans. Medicines and materials, that go to the humans. Food from agriculture goes to the humans. The surface and groundwater, that comes to the humans. Air for breathing comes from the human, or goes to the humans. Then hunting and harvesting, non-human biota. So we're talking about bacon and beef and chicken and turkey, stuff like that. Now that stuff is getting stuff from input from the air, getting input from the drinking water, getting input from the plant growth. It's also getting input from the non-target effects. So like that DDT and pesticides, getting into those guys as well. So all of this stuff gets into humans, which then gets transferred to the fetuses and to the babies, either in the womb or via breast milk. And we talk about that with the 10 Americans. Those 10 Americans were fetuses. And that's where they took the blood samples from. All right, moving on. Last page, 368. So most toxins degrade into similar compounds over time. They call breakdown products. So they're getting basically smaller and smaller. But there's bioaccumulation. We actually did a lab about this, obviously. Bioaccumulation, that's one organism's concentration is increasing. So basically, like one bird or one human, our concentration of those toxins is increasing. Then there's the whole process of biomagnification. So concentration in the food chain is increasing. And it's got a really good kind of image here. This is going to be talking about DDT, basically going in the water, to the zooplankton, to the small fish, to the large fish, to the osprey. So bioaccumulation is how much that individual osprey, that bird, is getting in its system. Then biomagnification is this whole process here. You start with a tiny amount, the next step has some more, next step has some more, next step has more, and the next step has more. That's what this biomagnification part is about. And that's what's happening to humans, that's what's happening in most food chains as well. All right, leave some questions. We got stuff to talk about.